They left her one phone call. Bruised, shaken, and desperate, Clara Johnson clutched the receiver in the dimly lit holding cell. Every muscle ached from the violent arrest, her wrists raw from the overly tight handcuffs. Her mind raced as she dialed the one number she'd promised herself never to use again. The dial tone seemed endless before the familiar voice answered. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need your help." On the other end, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Johnson's voice instantly sharpened, cutting through the static like a blade. "Clara, what's wrong?" She fought back tears, her pride battling against desperation. "They arrested me, Daniel, at a gas station in Pine Haven. They say I stole my own car." Daniel's silence spoke volumes. Clara knew her brother. His quiet meant controlled rage, not uncertainty. "I'm on my way," he said finally, the line going dead without further elaboration. At Bayview Precinct, Sheriff Frank Holloway was untouchable. For years, he had abused his badge, twisting laws and breaking bodies. He'd built an empire of fear, corruption, and power, fully believing he was beyond reach. No one dared to challenge him, not judges, not politicians, and certainly not ordinary citizens like Clara Johnson. But Daniel Johnson was different. Holloway had no idea he'd just made the gravest mistake of his career. Daniel was no ordinary man. As one of America's most decorated Delta Force commanders, he knew precisely how to dismantle powerful enemies. Tonight, he was coming for Holloway. Meanwhile, Clara sat trembling in a cold cell, her wrists bruised from Deputy Tate's unnecessarily rough treatment. Tears stung her eyes as the reality of her predicament sank in. How could this happen? She'd spent her life serving others as a nurse at Pine Haven Memorial Hospital. Yet tonight at the gas station, her uniform and identification had meant nothing. Only her skin color mattered to the deputies. She glanced around the bare concrete cell, lit dimly by flickering fluorescent lights. Outside, the muffled sounds of police chatter reminded her just how powerless she was. Her son Marcus, only 13 years old, had watched helplessly as they dragged her away. His terrified face haunted her thoughts. Down the hallway, Sheriff Holloway leaned back in his leather chair, unfazed as his deputies described Clara's arrest. He was accustomed to bending justice to fit his whims. "You sure about this one?" asked Deputy Wilkins hesitantly. "She's a nurse, says she just got off shift at Memorial Hospital." Holloway's steely eyes narrowed slightly. "She's exactly who we need," he said coldly. "People like her think they're above the law. This sends a message." His deputies nodded obediently. Questioning Holloway was a risk none of them dared to take. Across town, Marcus sat shaking in Mrs. Henderson's cozy living room. The elderly neighbor had always been kind, offering cookies and wisdom whenever Marcus needed comfort. Tonight, however, she shared his anger. "This isn't right," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice firm despite her age. "We need someone who can fight back." Marcus looked up at her with desperate eyes. "My Uncle Daniel is coming. He'll know what to do." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Good, your uncle knows how to handle bullies." Within hours, Daniel's vehicle, a powerful black SUV, sped into Pine Haven. His expression remained stony as memories of past battles blended with a fierce determination. It was one thing to face enemies abroad, another entirely when corrupt authorities targeted his own family. He wouldn't rest until Clara was safe, and those responsible paid the price. His first stop was Pine Haven Memorial Hospital. The administrator quickly provided evidence confirming Clara's employment and shift details, further proving the deputy's accusations baseless. Daniel's quiet fury intensified. At the precinct, Holloway received a troubling call. "Sheriff," came a panicked voice, "someone's here. Military, singing about Clara Johnson. He's got paperwork from Memorial." Holloway felt unease twist his stomach for the first time. "Send him in." When Daniel stepped into Holloway's office, his presence filled the room. Holloway instinctively knew he'd underestimated his opponent. "You arrested an innocent woman tonight," Daniel said calmly, placing the employment documents on Holloway's desk. "Release her now." Holloway stood, attempting authority. "Or what, Lieutenant Colonel?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or I dismantle this entire precinct brick by brick, exposing every dirty secret you hide." For the first time, fear flickered in Holloway's eyes. The untouchable sheriff finally sensed his vulnerability. Clara Johnson looked desperately back at Marcus, who stood frozen near the gas pump, tears streaming down his face. "Marcus!" she called urgently, her voice cracking with fear. "Call Mrs. Henderson. Tell her what happened." Mrs. Henderson was their elderly neighbor, a retired school teacher who often watched Marcus during Clara's late-night shifts. If anyone could help now, it would be her. "Shut up!" Deputy Eric Simmons hissed, tightening his grip painfully on Clara's arm. Just then, a black SUV rolled into the gas station, its heavy tires crunching over the shattered remnants of Marcus's cell phone. The driver's door opened slowly, and Sheriff Frank Holloway stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steely gray hair and ice-cold eyes, Holloway surveyed the scene as if it were a common inconvenience. "What's going on here, Simmons?" Sheriff Holloway asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Suspected auto theft, sir," Simmons replied quickly. The suspect resisted arrest and her kid interfered. Sheriff Holloway's gaze fell upon Clara, his eyes narrowing slightly in disdain. "Is that right?" He didn't wait for her response before turning back to his deputies, saying coldly, "You know what to do." A chill ran through Clara's spine at Holloway's words. There was something disturbingly routine about this situation, as if they'd performed this act countless times. "Please," she pleaded, locking eyes with Holloway, desperation evident in her voice. "My son, you should have raised him better," Holloway interrupted sharply. He nodded at Deputy Jake Miller, signaling to remove Clara from the scene. Miller roughly pushed Clara into the backseat of the cruiser, her head slamming against the doorframe with an audible thud. Pain exploded behind her eyes, but she bit down hard, refusing to cry out. The last thing she saw through tear-filled eyes was Marcus standing helplessly under the harsh glare of gas station lights, his small frame shaking uncontrollably. Inside the cruiser, Clara struggled to maintain her composure. She'd heard rumors about Pine Haven's corrupt Bayview precinct, innocent people disappearing into their cells on bogus charges, emerging battered and broken. Fear gripped her heart, not just for herself but for Marcus, now alone and vulnerable. As they sped down deserted streets illuminated only by flickering streetlights, Simmons glanced back at Clara through the rearview mirror, smirking cruelly. "Hope you didn't have plans anytime soon," he sneered. "Sheriff Holloway likes to ensure special guests fully experience Pine Haven's hospitality." Clara closed her eyes tightly, thinking of Daniel, her brother, a Delta Force commander possibly deployed thousands of miles away on some classified operation. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, their lives having drifted apart, but right now she desperately wished to hear his steady voice promising her everything would be okay. The cruiser suddenly veered away from the main road into darker, unfamiliar territory. "Where are we going?" Clara asked shakily, her pulse racing wildly. Miller twisted around, his grin cold and predatory. "Taking the scenic route. Sheriff prefers handling special cases personally." Her heart slammed painfully against her ribs. Terror flooded through her as the imposing outline of the Bayview precinct loomed into view, a forbidding concrete fortress illuminated by glaring floodlights. As the cruiser pulled silently into a concealed rear entrance, away from prying eyes, Clara couldn't shake the dreadful feeling she was being swallowed alive by something monstrous, something mercilessly corrupt, hidden deep within the town she'd once trusted. Clara Johnson looked desperately back at Marcus, who stood frozen near the gas pump, tears streaming down his face. "Marcus!" she called urgently, her voice cracking with fear. "Call Mrs. Henderson. Tell her what happened." Listus. Henderson was their elderly neighbor, a retired school teacher who often watched Marcus during Clara's late-night shifts. If anyone could help now, it would be her. "Shut up!" Deputy Eric Simmons hissed, tightening his grip painfully on Clara's arm. Just then, a black SUV rolled into the gas station, its heavy tires crunching over the shattered remnants of Marcus's cell phone. The driver's door opened slowly and Sheriff Frank Holloway stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steely gray hair and ice-cold eyes, Holloway surveyed the scene as if it were a common inconvenience. "What's going on here, Simmons?" Sheriff Holloway asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Suspected auto theft, sir," Simmons replied quickly. The suspect resisted arrest and her kid interfered. Sheriff Holloway's gaze fell upon Clara, his eyes narrowing slightly in disdain. "Is that right?" He didn't wait for her response before turning back to his deputies, saying coldly, "You know what to do." A chill ran through Clara's spine at Holloway's words. There was something disturbingly routine about this situation, as if they'd performed this act countless times. "Please," she pleaded, locking eyes with Holloway, desperation evident in her voice. My son? You should have raised him better, Holloway interrupted sharply. He nodded at Deputy Jake Miller, signaling to remove Clara from the scene. Miller roughly pushed Clara into the back seat of the cruiser, her head slamming against the door frame with an audible thud. Pain exploded behind her eyes, but she bit down hard, refusing to cry out. The last thing she saw through tear-filled eyes was Marcus standing helplessly under the harsh glare of gas station lights, his small frame shaking uncontrollably. Inside the cruiser, Clara struggled to maintain her composure. She'd heard rumors about Pine Haven's corrupt Bayview precinct, innocent people disappearing into their cells on bogus charges, emerging battered and broken. Fear gripped her heart, not just for herself but for Marcus, now alone and vulnerable. As they sped down deserted streets, illuminated only by flickering streetlights, Simmons glanced back at Clara through the rearview mirror, smirking cruelly. Hope you didn't have plans anytime soon, he sneered. Sheriff Holloway likes to ensure special guests fully experience Pine Haven's hospitality. Clara closed her eyes tightly, thinking of Daniel, her brother, a Delta Force commander, possibly deployed thousands of miles away on some classified operation. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, their lives having drifted apart, but right now she desperately wished to hear his steady voice promising her everything would be okay. The cruiser suddenly veered away from the main road into darker, unfamiliar territory. Where are we going? Clara asked shakily, her pulse racing wildly. Miller twisted around, his grin cold and predatory. Taking the scenic route, Sheriff prefers handling special cases personally. Her heart slammed painfully against her ribs. Terror flooded through her as the imposing outline of the Bayview precinct loomed into view, a forbidding concrete fortress illuminated by glaring floodlights. As the cruiser pulled silently into a concealed rear entrance, away from prying eyes, Clara couldn't shake the dreadful feeling she was being swallowed alive by something monstrous, something mercilessly corrupt, hidden deep within the town she'd once trusted. Their own versions of Pine Haven's processing. Janine shifted slightly, making space on the cold metal bench for Clara Johnson. You okay? Janine asked softly, noting Clara's pale, drawn face. Clara shook her head slowly, her throat tight, unable to form words. The sharp, stabbing pain in her stomach had dulled into a persistent ache, but the fear gripping her, fear for Marcus, for herself, and their uncertain future, threatened to drown her completely. They're trying to break you, Janine whispered, her voice steady but urgent. Don't let them. My son, Clara choked out, her voice barely audible. They said child services took him. A weary-looking woman from across the cell lifted her head, eyes filled with exhaustion and sadness. They tell everyone with kids that story, she explained gently. Half the time it's a lie, meant to scare you into compliance. And the other half? Clara asked weakly, dread gnawing at her. The woman glanced away, reluctant to speak further. You better hope someone outside cares enough to look after them. Time dragged painfully, each hour stretching endlessly. Clara drifted into restless, uneasy sleep, jolting awake at every noise. Around dawn, the heavy steel door creaked open. A disheveled man in a wrinkled suit holding an overflowing briefcase entered, looking harried and impatient. Johnson, he called flatly, barely glancing around. I'm Kevin Burris, your public defender. Clara rose slowly, cautious yet determined. I didn't request a public defender. I need to call my lawyer. Burris sighed irritably, checking his watch. Look, I've got 15 minutes before my next case. You want help or not? Reluctantly, Clara followed him into a cramped, sterile conference room. Unlike before, this one had a barred window facing a grimy brick wall. Burris skipped introductions, immediately flipping through a stack of papers. You're in serious trouble, he announced bluntly. Car theft, narcotics possession, resisting arrest. None of that's true, Clara interrupted urgently. They planted drugs. They fabricated charges. I was just pumping gas with my son. Everyone says that, Burris replied dismissively, barely lifting his eyes. Because it happens here, Clara pressed, voice cracking in desperation. Ask any woman in that cell. This precinct targets people like me, plants evidence. Save it, Burris interjected sharply, cutting her off. Tell that story to someone who cares. Here's the deal they're offering. Plead guilty to disorderly conduct and minor drug possession. They drop the theft charge and you serve 6 months, maybe less. You expect me to plead guilty to something I didn't do? Clara stared at him, incredulous. Burris finally looked up, his eyes betraying fleeting sympathy. Listen carefully, Miss Johnson. What really happened doesn't matter here. Only what the police say matters. There were witnesses at the gas station, Clara argued, desperate. And how many of those witnesses will risk testifying against Sheriff Holloway? Burris shook his head grimly. Be realistic. No judge in Pine Haven is siding with you over the sheriff. Clara's eyes filled with tears, frustration boiling inside her. So I'm just supposed to accept their lies? Lose my child, my life? I'm not saying it's fair, Burris said, gathering his documents, but it's reality. Realization dawned on Clara, sharp and painful. You're working with them, she whispered bitterly. Burris paused at the door, a flicker of shame in his expression. Everyone works with them, he murmured quietly. That's how Pine Haven functions. He glanced at his watch again, impatient. Consider the deal. It's your best chance. As Burris exited, an officer returned Clara to the holding cell, the brutal reality weighing heavily on her. But deep within, defiance sparked. There was someone who could help, someone she hadn't reached out to in years. Her brother, Daniel Johnson, a Delta Force commander known for taking on insurmountable odds. Hours later, around 8:00 a.m., an officer summoned her gruffly. Johnson, phone call, 5 minutes. Her heart pounded as she approached the payphone, fingers shaking as she dialed a special emergency line Daniel had given her. After 3 nerve-wracking rings, he answered with calm precision. Daniel, Clara whispered, voice breaking with relief. It's Clara, I need you. She rapidly described everything, her wrongful arrest, the fabricated charges, Marcus left abandoned and alone. As Daniel listened silently, Clara felt his anger, a powerful force even across continents. Who's responsible? Daniel finally asked, his voice dangerously controlled. Sheriff Frank Holloway, Deputy Eric Simmons, Officer Jake Miller, Bayview Precinct. Clara recited each name carefully. They're framing me, Daniel. They're threatening Marcus. Stay strong, Daniel replied instantly, unwavering determination filling his voice. I'm coming. What should I do? She asked desperately. Resist nothing, sign nothing, give them no reason to hurt you, Daniel instructed swiftly. Wait 24 hours, no more. This ends today. The line disconnected, but Clara remained gripping the receiver, drawing strength from his promise. As she turned, she found Sheriff Holloway standing behind her, suspicious. Productive call? He questioned sharply. Just informing family, Clara replied evenly, her voice steadier now. Who exactly did you call? Holloway pressed, sensing something amiss. Someone who doesn't tolerate injustice, Clara said quietly, holding his gaze firmly. Sheriff Holloway's confidence wavered slightly, uncertainty flickering briefly across his hardened features. Take her back, he ordered brusquely. Returning to the cell, Clara saw Marcus suddenly entering the precinct lobby, holding Mrs. Henderson's hand tightly. Clara's heart soared with relief. Mrs. Henderson approached the front desk, her voice authoritative and unwavering. I'm here for Clara Johnson and to report child abandonment by your officers, she announced boldly. Or shall I call the Attorney General's office directly? Holloway emerged, visibly shaken by her unexpected arrival. Miss Henderson, this is a restricted area. Seems you still run Pine Haven like your private kingdom, Mrs. Henderson retorted icily, challenging Holloway openly. Holloway's eyes narrowed dangerously. Careful, even respected educators can cross the line. But Clara no longer felt fear. Daniel was coming, justice was coming, and Sheriff Holloway's reign of terror was finally nearing its end. Denise didn't flinch. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Because I keep excellent records. Would you like me to share them with the State Attorney General or perhaps the FBI? For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Mercer forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. Always the fighter, Denise. But this isn't your battle. He nodded curtly to Wilkins. Finish processing the prisoner. Denise turned defiantly to Maya, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. Don't worry about Elijah. He'll stay with me until you're released. And you will be released, she finished pointedly, staring directly at Mercer. Maya knelt, hugging Elijah as best she could with her restrained hands. Be good for Mrs. Henderson, okay? I'll be home soon. Promise? Elijah's voice trembled softly. Promise, Maya reassured him firmly. Remember what I always tell you. Thompson family never breaks a promise, Elijah whispered, offering a small smile despite his fear. Wilkins roughly escorted Maya toward the exit. She glanced back at Denise and Elijah, standing bravely together, a small island of love amidst an ocean of corruption. Denise nodded reassuringly, and Maya mouthed a heartfelt, "Thank you." "Your neighborhood watchdog won't help you where you're going," Wilkins sneered in her ear. "She already has," Maya responded calmly, knowing Elijah was safe. 3,000 miles away at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Daniel Johnson stood in a secure command room. His face was carved from granite as he reviewed satellite images of Pine Haven. Following Clara's desperate call, he had rushed home, leveraging favors at the Pentagon to expedite his return. His reputation within Delta Force meant no one questioned the urgency. "What have we got?" Daniel asked his team. Marcus Reynolds, his intelligence analyst and right-hand man, stepped forward. "Sheriff Frank Holloway has controlled Bayview Precinct for over a decade. Numerous complaints of corruption, brutality, and racial profiling, but nothing ever sticks. He's shielded by powerful local connections." "Political ties?" Daniel asked sharply. "Very deep," replied Catherine Lewis, a cybersecurity expert. "He's closely tied to State Senator Edward Thompson and Judge Anna Jefferson. They're old college friends, fraternity brothers." Henry Crawford, their financial specialist, displayed documents on another screen. Holloway's living well beyond his official income, properties, luxury cars, and yachts. Early signs suggest heavy involvement with organized crime along I-95. "What about my sister and nephew?" Daniel asked with urgency. "They transferred Clara to county lockup earlier than usual," Reynolds said. "Our state contacts confirm Holloway's panicking. He's likely worried someone influential is involved." "My nephew," Daniel demanded. "Safe with Mrs. Henderson," Lewis said reassuringly. "She confronted Holloway openly and threatened to escalate to the state attorney general. That's probably why Clara was transferred." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Clara knows how to choose her friends." He stared intently at the maps and satellite feeds. This was familiar terrain, reminiscent of overseas missions. The only difference, his adversaries here wore badges, not insurgent uniforms. "Gather everything we can, every wrongful arrest, every planted evidence case, every victim too frightened to speak out." Reynolds exchanged a cautious glance with Lewis. "Daniel, you're planning to take down an entire police department. If things go wrong, they won't," Daniel interrupted sharply. "I'm handling this personally. My family, my responsibility." "It's our fight too," Reynolds shot back immediately. Lewis nodded agreement. "Always has been," Lewis added firmly. "Just give us the orders." Daniel felt a wave of gratitude for these comrades who had followed him into danger countless times. Phase 1, secure Clara and Marcus. Phase 2, dismantle Holloway's operation permanently. In the back of the police van, Clara sat rigid, handcuffed to a metal bench as deputies Simmons and Miller drove silently through unfamiliar back roads. Her pulse quickened with every turn away from the main highway. "Where are we going?" she demanded. "Taking the scenic route," Simmons sneered. Clara stayed calm, thinking quickly. "Many people know where I am," she warned, voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson, my lawyer," Wilkins laughed harshly. "Your public defender works for us. As for the old lady, who's going to believe her against sworn officers?" Suddenly, the radio crackled. "Unit 12, Sheriff Holloway orders immediate return to the precinct. Federal agents are investigating." Tate cursed loudly, spinning the van in a sharp U-turn. Maya steadied herself. "Guess your scenic tour will have to wait," she muttered. Wilkins glared at her. "Don't get comfortable. This isn't over." As the van raced back to Bayview Precinct, FBI agents were already gathering outside. Inside, Sheriff Holloway paced nervously, barking orders. Agents stormed the building, confiscating evidence. Holloway, losing control, grabbed Maya's arm roughly as she arrived. "Who did you call?" "My brother," Maya said simply. "Who exactly is your brother?" Holloway demanded. A commanding voice interrupted from the entrance. "Someone you should have never messed with." FBI Special Agent Henry Crawford stepped forward, flashing credentials. "Sheriff Holloway, you're under federal investigation." Holloway paled. Maya felt her heart swell with hope. Outside, Daniel Johnson awaited, determined and unyielding. Clara, freed and reunited with Marcus and Mrs. Henderson, embraced her brother tightly. "You came," she whispered. "Always," Daniel assured her. Weeks later, inside a packed courtroom, justice unfolded meticulously. Judge Anna Jefferson, known for integrity, presided firmly. Clara testified courageously, detailing her terrifying encounter at the gas station, exposing Holloway's brutal tactics. Evidence mounted: surveillance videos, financial trails, testimony from numerous victims. Attorney Henry Crawford laid bare the systematic corruption, painting an undeniable picture of brutality and exploitation under Holloway's reign. Holloway's defense unraveled as accomplices began distancing themselves, turning state's evidence in a desperate bid for leniency. Clara's bravery sparked community outrage, leading to massive protests demanding change. Holloway was convicted, along with Simmons and Wilkins, their sentences becoming symbols of justice triumphing over corruption. Months later, Clara stood proudly alongside Daniel at a community rally celebrating reforms. Holding Elijah's hand tightly, she finally felt safe. Justice had prevailed, thanks to courage, family loyalty, and the relentless pursuit of truth. 3 months after the warehouse confrontation, the Pine Haven County Courthouse was surrounded by media vans, their satellite dishes stretching skyward like sentinels, reporters vying for position alongside groups of protesters holding signs demanding justice for Sheriff Holloway's victims. A few uniformed officers from neighboring precincts stood silently nearby, uneasy reminders of law enforcement's precarious position in the public eye. Inside courtroom number 3, Clara Johnson sat stiffly in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Marcus nervously adjusted his tie, a 13-year-old forced to mature too quickly after everything they'd endured. Daniel Johnson sat quietly next to Marcus, his military discipline evident even in civilian clothing, a silent guardian who'd already proven his willingness to defend family at all costs. "All rise," the bailiff commanded as Judge Anna Jefferson entered the room. Unlike Judge Edward Thompson, who had recused himself due to ties with Holloway, Judge Jefferson had been specifically appointed because of her unwavering reputation for fairness and strict adherence to the law. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and began reviewing the thick file before her. "Be seated," Judge Jefferson ordered, her voice firm. "Case number 2025 CR 8731, United States versus Eric Simmons and Jake Miller." Clara watched as the 2 former deputies, now stripped of their authority and dignity, sat rigidly beside their attorneys. Simmons glowered defiantly, but Miller appeared visibly shaken, constantly scanning the room as if haunted by unseen enemies. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Harmon approached the podium confidently, delivering a powerful opening statement outlining systematic abuses perpetrated by the defendants. As he spoke, Clara felt herself transported back to that horrific night at the gas station. The cruel smirks, the assault, the helplessness she felt as they tore her from Marcus. Her hands trembled, and Marcus gently grasped them, squeezing reassuringly. Harmon methodically described a pattern of abuse spanning years. Dozens of innocent Black Pine Haven residents falsely arrested, evidence planted, lives shattered by baseless charges. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Harmon detailed Simmons and Miller's roles as Holloway's chief enforcers, the faces of oppression in a system designed not to protect, but to subjugate. When defense attorney William Stanley rose, he adopted a strategy meant to evoke sympathy, portraying his clients as mere pawns following Sheriff Holloway's orders. "My clients were operating within a system controlled by fear," Stanley argued, casting a dramatic glance at the jury. "To oppose Sheriff Holloway was to risk their careers, or worse." Judge Jefferson interjected sharply, her voice firm. "Let's be clear, Mr. Stanley. Following orders has not excused criminal behavior since Nuremberg." A ripple passed through the courtroom, quickly silenced by Jefferson's stern gaze. On the 8th day of the trial, Clara took the witness stand. Calm settled over her as she recounted clearly and steadily the details of her brutal arrest, the threats to her son, and the psychological torment inflicted by Holloway's deputies. "Did either defendant ever express concern about your treatment?" Harmon asked gently. "No," Clara replied, her voice unwavering. "They seemed to take pleasure in it." Defense attorney Stanley rose aggressively. "Miss Johnson, isn't it true your brother, a Delta Force commander, effectively launched a private war against Pine Haven police?" "Objection. Relevance," Harmon challenged. Judge Jefferson allowed it cautiously. "Answer briefly." "My brother acted to protect us," Clara stated firmly. "After we were kidnapped by mercenaries hired by Sheriff Holloway, everything he did was in coordination with the FBI." Stanley shifted tactics quickly. Did you personally believe officers would specifically target you? Personally, no, Clara answered carefully, but as a black woman in Pine Haven, I was aware of the department's reputation. Many others had experienced similar injustices. Stanley tried pressing further, but gained no ground. Clara remained resolute, her calm clarity visibly unsettling him. Days later, the most powerful testimony came from Jake Miller himself. Seeking leniency, Miller recounted the precinct's corruption in graphic detail, admitting evidence was routinely fabricated, arrests unjustified, and abuses widespread. Miss Johnson wasn't targeted randomly, Miller confessed bitterly. Sheriff Holloway had quotas to meet, and we were behind. She was just convenient. As the defense argued, Miller was lying to save himself. The damage was irreparable. His detailed account aligned perfectly with evidence already presented, solidifying the prosecution's case. On the final day, the jury returned swiftly. On charges of conspiracy against civil rights, falsifying evidence, and assault under color of law, we find defendants Eric Simmons and Jake Miller guilty. As the verdict echoed through the courtroom, Clara felt relief surge through her. Elijah squeezed her hand tighter, pride evident in his youthful face. Beside them, Darius nodded slightly, allowing a rare moment of visible satisfaction. Outside, reporters clamored for comment. Clara addressed them steadily. This victory isn't mine alone. It's for everyone who suffered in silence, who believed justice was beyond reach. Today shows that justice is possible, but our work has only begun. In the months following the trial, Pine Haven slowly healed. Clara launched the Johnson Justice Initiative, dedicated to protecting civil rights and preventing future abuses. Darius stayed involved, lending his expertise, quietly ensuring their fight would continue effectively. Simmons and Miller were sentenced, bringing some closure, but Clara knew deeper systemic change required constant vigilance. As she watched Elijah play basketball outside their home with neighborhood friends, she reflected on their painful journey. "This isn't over," she murmured softly to Darius. He nodded knowingly, his voice firm with conviction. "No, Clara, it's just beginning." Their fight against corruption and injustice would continue, not just for themselves, but for all who followed. Pine Haven had finally awakened, and now the real work could begin. 3 months after the confrontation at the warehouse, the Pine Haven County Courthouse had become a symbol of transformation and accountability. Reporters and spectators crowded the steps, eager to witness justice finally catching up to years of corruption. Clara Johnson sat quietly in the front row of courtroom 3, her hands clasped firmly in her lap. Beside her, Marcus nervously adjusted his tie, the burden of recent events reflected in his eyes. Daniel Johnson, her brother, sat beside Marcus, composed and vigilant as ever, his calm strength radiating reassurance. "All rise," commanded the bailiff as Judge Anna Jefferson entered the courtroom. Newly appointed after the federal investigation, Judge Jefferson was known for fairness, unwavering in her adherence to the law. "Be seated," she instructed, reviewing the documents in front of her. Case number 2024 CR 7851, United States versus Eric Simmons and Jake Miller. Clara's gaze moved to the defense table where the 2 former deputies sat, stripped of their badges and uniforms. Simmons appeared defiant, attempting to maintain an air of authority, while Miller looked visibly shaken, his eyes darting anxiously around the room. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Harmon rose, outlining the prosecution's case with clarity, detailing how the defendants systematically abused their power, planting evidence, falsifying reports, and brutalizing innocent citizens. Defense attorney William Stanley, polished and experienced, stood next. "Your Honor, my clients were victims themselves trapped by the corrupt culture created by Sheriff Holloway," Stanley argued, attempting to shift blame to the deceased sheriff. Daniel tensed slightly beside Clara, recognizing the tactic immediately. As the trial progressed, testimonies from former inmates and citizens painted a damning picture of Willow Ridge's HOA corruption, coordinated by Holloway and enforced ruthlessly by Simmons and Miller. Clara was called to the stand, her voice unwavering as she recounted her ordeal, the fabricated charges, the assault, and threats against her son. Despite Stanley's aggressive cross-examination, Clara stood firm. "My brother intervened to protect us after we were kidnapped by mercenaries hired by Sheriff Holloway," she asserted calmly. "Every action he took was coordinated with federal authorities." The decisive moment came when Miller took the stand, accepting a plea deal to testify against Simmons. He revealed Holloway's hidden policies targeting black residents, detailing the routine planting of drugs and weapons to meet arbitrary quotas. Miller's testimony, chilling in its matter-of-factness, sealed the prosecution's case. After just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. Relief washed over Clara, tears filling her eyes, not from vindication, but from the knowledge that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Outside the courthouse, Clara faced reporters, speaking passionately about the newly formed Johnson Justice Initiative, dedicated to reforming community police relations and supporting victims of injustice. As Marcus stood beside her, proudly, Daniel watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing their battle against corruption had set a precedent. That evening, surrounded by allies at a local diner, Clara reflected on the journey, from victim to advocate, from fear to hope. Though the immediate threat had ended, the fight against systemic injustice was far from over. Together, strengthened by their ordeal, the Johnson family was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in their resolve and unified by their unwavering belief that justice, true justice, was always worth fighting for. If you found this story meaningful and want to support the fight against injustice, please take a moment to like and comment below. Your voice matters, and sharing your thoughts helps more people discover these powerful stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content that exposes corruption, champions justice, and celebrates those brave enough to stand against wrongdoing. Click the bell icon to stay updated on our newest videos. Your support empowers us to keep bringing awareness to important issues and advocating for a fairer world for everyone. Join our community today, and let's ensure these stories continue to create real change together.